Breadbox Media programming is brought to you by...
Hello, this is international Catholic singer Anna Nuzzo, inviting you to join me and Father Dan Cambra of the Marian Fathers on a select international tour's Divine Mercy pilgrimage to Poland and the Czech Republic. It takes place in September of 2019, and we would love for you to join us. For more information, go to my website, annanuzzo.com. Thank you, and God bless.
Looking for the perfect First Communion, Confirmation, or RCIA gift? Consider a beautiful, heirloom quality, made-in-Italy rosary from Ghirelli. A Ghirelli rosary will be prayed with and cherished forever, guaranteed. Shop Ghirelli today. That's GHIRELLI.com. Introducing the redesigned CatholicSingles.com, featuring new ways that put the spotlight on the person and their faith, not just a profile picture. For the past 20 years, faithful Catholics have used CatholicSingles.com, and the reimagined CatholicSingles.com website is ready to help single Catholics take the next step in sharing meaningful relationships with other faithful Catholics. Remember, CatholicSingles.com for faith, fellowship, and love. Wait a minute! 60 Seconds of Reflection with Martha Fernandez-Sardina.
He is risen! The Lord is risen from the dead. That is the song of Christians. The Lord is risen, alleluia. He is truly risen, as he said, alleluia, alleluia. For centuries, Christians the world over have been celebrating the fact that Christ defeated death. He killed death. Death is dead. Life is alive. And Jesus is alive and well, and he is inviting each one of us, knocking at the door of our hearts, to enter in, to sup with us, to dine with us, to give us his very body and blood, soul and divinity as our food. Will you welcome him? Will you season it up? Will you enjoy this Easter Sunday, Easter octave, and Easter season, 50 days of glorious celebration, and come closer to Jesus to receive the new life that he has won for you? You are one by one who is God Almighty. Enjoy Easter, enjoy the resurrection, enjoy Jesus.
For more information about Martha, visit marthafernandezsardina.com.
Everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Lisa, Hendey, and Friends. I'm really excited about this week's show. We're featuring a creative filmmaker who has taken on a subject that is very near and dear to my heart. Before we dive in, though, I want to thank you for your prayers. You've all been so kind and supportive. Just keep them coming. Family situations are challenging right now, and I'm just really, really, truly grateful for the outpouring of prayers for our family. Our guest on today's show is actually the director of a documentary film that will be opening in selected cities on April 26th and then nationwide on May 3rd. Patrick Creadon directs the film Hesburgh, which offers a unique glimpse at more than 50 years of American history. Father Hesburgh is a civil rights champion, an educator, advisor to presidents, and envoy to popes, theologian, and activist. He was called on by countless world leaders to tackle the most challenging issues of his day. Let's take a listen now to the theatrical trailer for the documentary Hesburgh.
In any list of the most influential men in American life, you'll find the predictable political leaders, commentators, and tycoons. But one name that keeps cropping up is one of those things. He advises presidents.
He was a mythic figure.
Confers with the Pope.
We heard these stories about this legend.
He is chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation.
My God, how many lives did this man live?
He is Father Theodore Martin Hesburgh, president of the University of Notre Dame.
Oh boy, here we go.
Father Hesburgh had an extraordinary ability to reach across lines.
We all ought to be protesting against many of the things we see in modern life.
I heard from some he was a very progressive liberal, from some he was a very conservative man of the cloth.
Father Hesburgh was a giant of the civil rights movement.
We are verging towards two societies, one black and one white, and that wouldn't be America, I don't think.
He was asked to join Martin Luther King in Chicago.
He was aware of threats made against him and other civil rights leaders.
His only response was, "When do you want me there?"
Robert Anson, Time magazine, is presumed captured by the Viet Cong.
He put his AK to my forehead, and I knew I was digging my own grave. I knew exactly one word of Vietnamese: peace. Father Hesburgh called the Pope, and he said, unless you can intervene, he'll be dead.
You're one of the most influential men in this country, aren't you?
I don't think I'm trying to be. I know a lot of people. A lot of it's just power of friendship.
U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was going nowhere.
The president called Father Ted.
Father Hesburgh became the conscience of the country.
We've got a plain problem with Hesburgh. He's always attacking us. And let's kill the damage.
He wasn't afraid of anybody.
We don't prove anything by burning something down. We prove something by building it up.
Being a priest is an isolated life. There's no family. There were no kids to raise. He did that to be a father to all people.
He could bring people together.
That's the kind of leader we need today.
We just don't have those kind of figures anymore.
I just owe him everything.
Well, next up on the podcast, I'm very excited to welcome a guest with whom I think I share some things in common. And I'm so really super psyched to have this conversation with Patrick Creadon, who is the director of a new documentary, which will be opening in theaters, selective theaters on April 26th, and then nationwide, Hesburgh, which is the amazing documentary of a person who should be well known to many of our listeners, Reverend Theodore Hesburgh, Holy Cross priest and long-term president of the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to the show, Patrick. So great to have you on.
Great to be here, Lisa. Thank you.
So I sort of feel like, since we're both grads of the University of Notre Dame, that one of the things that we do traditionally in Notre Dame circles is to ask all those questions like, what year did you graduate? What dorm did you live in? What was your major? So I can tell you that I'm 1985 Walsh and a French major. So
awesome. I was Dillon Hall, class of 89. I was an international relations major.
Dylan, so my husband, Greg, that I met at Notre Dame, we got married in the Basilica, but he was Holy Cross, which is somewhat, I'm sorry, not Holy Cross, nice. Alumni Hall, which is your next door neighbor.
Oh, he's
rivals.
Alumni. Okay,
yeah.
Right next door. They're our rivals.
Yeah, so great to have you on, and I'm really psyched to talk about the film. But before we do that, I always like to ask a little bit about, just like, tell us a little bit about your story and how you got to this point in your career and your life.
Sure. So I grew up in Chicago. I was a big fan of public television, and I did a little bit of modeling and acting when I was a little kid, growing up in Chicago, like McDonald's commercials and things like that. And at a very young age, I kind of fell in love with this idea of storytelling and filmmaking. And I also decided really early on that I thought it would be really interesting to be one of the people behind the camera. So really, when I was about 7 or 8 years old, this idea came to me that, I wanted to tell stories and I wanted to work in the world of filmmaking. I was also a big fan of 60 Minutes, and I was a big fan of public television. Always loved nonfiction, storytelling, loved the New York Times. And I just sort of put those two things together, and right out of the gate, right as soon as I graduated from college, I got a job at the local PBS station in Chicago called WTTW. A few years later, I went to grad school at the American Film Institute in Los Angeles. I ended up meeting my wife out here. She's also a fellow Chicagoan. we met out here, and we've been here ever since. We have 3 daughters, and Christine and I are a filmmaking team. We've done 7 feature-length films over the past 12 years. Probably our most well-known film is a movie called Wordplay, which was about the New York Times crossword puzzle. That was a big hit back in 2006. We also did an ESPN 30 for 30 sports film about Notre Dame football called Catholics versus Convicts, which profiled the 1988 Notre Dame versus Miami college football game. And that was a great project. I got to meet a lot of the Miami players and coaches and Notre Dame players and coaches. Many of the players were my classmates at the time. And that was a really, really well-known and a very successful project we did a few years ago. And making that film is kind of what led us to making Hesburgh. I spent quite a bit of time on campus when I was making that ESPN film. And Father Ted had recently died. He died in 2015. And I sort of, if you kind of are in the Notre Dame community, or even vaguely familiar with Notre Dame, the name Father Ted Hesburgh is probably familiar to you. And it was a story, we knew it was going to be a big, very satisfying kind of American story about this Catholic priest who made the world a better place. I can tell you we had no idea the size and scope and influence that Father Ted had during his lifetime.
Well, the project is absolutely phenomenal in terms of its scope, and I can't wait to dive into some of the particular people that you talked to along the way. Before we do that, I want to give a shout out to your wife, Christine O'Malley, your producer, or listed as producer on Hesburgh. And I just want to know, kind of, you gave us a little bit of a backdrop, but with the timing of this and coming sort of following his passing, which was a passing felt around the world, literally, by the Notre Dame family and so many other people. What kind of access, or when you choose to do a project like this, a documentary film, I noted that you had lots of people involved in the film, like Father Jenkins and other members of administration. So how do you approach a project like that? Do you initially go to the university and say, this is what we have in mind, and we'd like to work with you on it, or is independence important in a documentary?
Well, that's a great question. I would say that's a fundamental question when you make documentary films. We have always only made films where we have independence, creative independence, and we do not, we do not. We don't do films for hire, if you want to call it that way, or use those terms. Because I think the story, first of all, I think the story suffers and gets watered down. And secondly, the audiences are too smart for that. The audiences can smell a puff piece from a mile away. So we went to the university and said, we would like to do a story about Father Ted. We would like full access to his archives and the university archives, and we want to interview, a whole group of people in the Notre Dame community. Like you said, Father Jenkins, our current president, Father Hesburgh's family members, many of whom are in the film, and a whole bunch of folks. And they said, that sounds great. I think they understood that we had to be independent. We did not take one penny from the school to make the movie. We raised the movie. We raised all the money to make the film independently, and so it was an independent effort. Now, that said, I went to Notre Dame,
right?
And I'm very familiar with the subject, but I didn't really let that affect the story that we were telling. I sort of hold our the journalistic integrity of what we're doing is as important to me as it would be for someone who's writing for the Wall Street Journal or writing for the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or you name it, NPR, etc. We if you don't have that independence, I don't think you have anything, frankly.
And that's significant when you're talking about Notre Dame, because so many people know, it's sort of, there's always one degree of separation to Notre Dame. Somebody always knows someone who went there. And if you know us, you know that we are very devoted to, most of us are very devoted to our alma mater, despite the fact that we believe, the university is imperfect as any institution is. This is not, definitely when you go in to see Hesburgh, you will not be treated to sort of the raw Notre Dame kind of thing that maybe you're expecting. It's a very intellectual look at a historical figure who has political impact, faith impact, and so it's really interesting how the story plays out. I want to ask you about the decision that you made to use an element of storytelling, kind of first person narration, and how that, how you decided to do that. And I didn't know who voices the narration for Father Ted. Say a little bit about that choice as a filmmaker.
Yeah, that's a great question. We had hours and hours of Father Ted speaking, and interviews with him, et cetera. So we probably could have used the actual audio of him speaking. The problem is he was giving an interview. He wasn't narrating a film or telling a story, so to speak. So what we did instead was we found an extremely talented actor by the name of Maurice LaMarche. He's very well known in the world of animation and voiceover work. And, we auditioned dozens of people, but Maurice sort of kind of captured the essence of Father Ted in a way that we thought was really, really emotionally satisfying. And then we wrote the voiceover based on interviews that Father Ted had given. We might have changed an to a the, or an and to a and or something. You know what I mean? Like we made like minor sort of very for sort of minimal adjustments in order to tie the film together and make the story really cohesive. But we made no changes at all to any of the meanings or any of his firm beliefs, et cetera. So it's a little bit of a, we thought long and hard if that was something we wanted to do. And frankly, I think the movie really benefits from having this really strong emotional narrator who's sort of playing the part of Father Ted. And we're very clear in the film. It says right off the bat that the narration is based on the writings and interviews of Father Ted Hesburgh. And one of the very first credits at the end of the movie is the credit to the voiceover artist. And I think I'm really happy with that decision. I think that what you'll find for people who are fans of documentary films is the documentary films of today are much different than they were even 15 years ago. Documentary used to be talking head, shot of a B-roll, then more talking head, and then shot of a photograph, etc. They were a little more old-fashioned, if you will. And today, there's a lot more tools at our disposal, which I think make these movies really, really satisfying.
That's actually something that I wanted to ask you about. Well, I agree with you that the device of the narration is a wonderful kind of like, it lends a thread to the project and binds it together and definitely also personalizes it in a way that's great. And we do hear enough of Father Ted's voice, on film that you have throughout, that's capturing him in the moment that you have the reality of that as well. But on this topic of documentary, I'm a huge fan of documentary, and I love to see that it's getting such popular explosion. I mean, one of my favorite projects from last year is the film Free Solo. I don't know if you saw that.
Oh yeah,
and I love that. That is now something that we can go see in the theater. You've gravitated toward that format, and you talk a little bit about why. But why do you think that it's the right choice for this story? Because you definitely could make a blockbuster movie about Father Ted as well.
So gravitating toward
documentary format,
towards documentary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, that's a good question. I've always I've always been fascinated by nonfiction films, nonfiction stories. To me, a story that's based on a true story or is a true story, like a documentary film, it just has a tremendous advantage that a narrative film really doesn't have. Now, obviously, I love movies like Star Wars and things like that Jaws, movies that are made up, they're fictional. But when I think of like Ken Burns's work, like the Civil War, for example, or I think about the work of somebody like Errol Morris, who did a great movie called The Fog of War, about the Vietnam War, or I think of movies like Free Solo, like you mentioned, or the Mr. Rogers film that came out last year. There's something, it gives me goosebumps. There's something about really taking a deep dive on a real story and a real human being and examining their life in great detail that narrative films can never, ever touch. And I think what we've seen, I've been making documentary films now for 30 years, believe it or not. I got out of school, as I mentioned, in 1989. This is my 30th year of doing this. Documentaries have come a very, very long way from where they were when I started. People use recreation, they use animation, they use voiceover, they use great music, all sorts of, countless sort of new tricks that we didn't necessarily have years ago. And I think that's exactly why the audience for nonfiction continues to grow, because this is no longer something like the green vegetable of filmmaking, if you will, the healthy food, healthy eating. Documentaries can be every bit as fascinating and as entertaining as a narrative film. And I think I will tell you, there's one thing about Hesburgh that was really surprising to us. We really didn't know what we had with this film until we had our world premiere. This was back in June. We had a world premiere in Washington, D.C. at a very prestigious film festival, the American Film Institute's Documentary Film Festival. They host it every year in Washington. We had no idea what kind of feedback we would get from a general audience when we showed the movie. And there was a film critic who interviewed me shortly before the screening. She had seen the film the night before, and she wanted, she was doing a story about our film. And she said, I have to tell you, I was not raised in the Catholic tradition. I'm Jewish. I didn't know anything about Father Hesburgh, never even heard his name before. And I found myself crying through huge chunks of the movie. It was extremely emotional to me. And I asked her like specifically what it was that she found so emotional. And she paused for a minute, thought about it, and said, "It's his kindness."
Wow.
He was an extraordinarily influential man on the planet for about 50 years. Like one of the great, like the guy behind the scenes who's getting things done and doing the right things to make the world a better place. And yet his secret weapon, maybe other than his faith, which was central to his life, but I think his secret weapon was his kindness.
Well, you see that you see that play out in the relationships that are, shown in the film.
Absolutely.
And at so many levels, he connected with people who were outside of his immediate sphere of, faith background or logistical background, not to mention, his huge political impact. But there are two relationships that I think of that might have touched a woman like the critic that you're mentioning, and that's his relationship with Ann Landers, Epi, and also, a fellow member of the Civil Rights Commission who was, it was the gentleman who was a board member at the University of Notre Dame, the Board of Trustees. And it shows that Father Ted did reach outside of kind of the safe circles often, and that makes a difference.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that there's something about Father Ted Hesburgh that I don't think anyone can deny. He walked the walk. You know, he was first and foremost, he was a priest. It was central to his identity. I think second to that, he was an educator. So for 35 years, he was the president of the University of Notre Dame. Luckily, he had an executive vice president, basically his right-hand man, a guy named Father Ned Joyce. Father Ned was kind of, people refer to him as like, he was like the inside guy. He was the guy on campus really making sure that the trains ran on time and that everything on campus was functioning properly. Father Ted, kind of the outside guy. Father Ted spent a huge part of his time as president away from campus. And I think the reason he did that was because he wanted to be an example to the students and saying, you're getting a great education here at Notre Dame, but now we want you to take this education and go out in the world and do something and do the right thing in your daily activities. Do what you can to help people in need. Do what you can to help advance people in their struggles, whatever those struggles may be. And Father Ted did that. That was really the hallmark to his time as president of Notre Dame, was that he was out in the world trying to make the world a better place. I know you hear that a lot. That's sort of like a platitude, like, oh, make the world a better place. Father Ted is actually one of those people who really did that. And in our film, you see time and again, there's so many sort of head slap moments, I think, in our film where you're thinking, I can't believe that one man was involved in as many of the things that he was involved in. It's extraordinary. His life is incredibly inspirational for folks from all walks of life.
I'm kind of curious about, I know the film is written by William Neal, Nick Andert, and Jerry Barca. And I'm just kind of curious, though, as a filmmaker, when you decide to take on a project like this, as the director, do you work with the writing team, but clearly there's a ton of historical research that's involved in this. Who kind of heads that up? And what did you learn personally about history and the history of that era of time through making the film?
Well, you know, because my wife and I have our own production company, and we don't really answer to anyone else. We answer to ourselves. We can do things the way we want to do them and the way that they make the most sense. And for this particular project, Jerry Barca, he is one of the producers on the film, and he was on board from day one. And he and I helped frame up what we thought the main sort of skeleton of the story is, so to speak, meaning like what's the shape, the overall shape of the story, and what are the beats along the way that are going to be important to the story. At the same time, William Neal and Nick Andert, those were our two editors. They were the ones in the edit bay, day in and day out, week in and week out, for over a year. And because they were more familiar with the footage and the interviews than we were, they helped shape the voiceover and the narration and really craft the story. It's a very, very complicated story. It's not a complicated film, but the story itself is very complicated. Yes. And I rely, as the director, you know, my job as the director is to tell the best story. You know, and my job is basically like when the lights go down in the theater and there's a sold out audience ready to be entertained for 100 minutes, if they're not entertained, that's on me. It's my job to get the movie to do what I want the movie to do and do the things that I want the audience to experience. But I relied really heavily on Jerry and Nick and William to really piece together and shape the story and also the narration. And William Neal, I should mention, he was on the project longer than anyone else on the edit team, and he in particular did a very, very strong job in doing the final pass on the narration and the voiceover. And I think that's kind of the glue, I think, that really holds the story together. So he in particular just did a wonderful job.
Well, you're combining so many elements here of journalistic footage from, noted news sources, because so much of this was, history in the making, especially during the civil rights movement, the Vietnam era time, but also, university documents and footage. I loved the portions at Land O'Lakes and just, so many scenes on campus. You're seeing Notre Dame in maybe a way that you had never really seen it before. So editing is really crucial to that. I want to ask you about the involvement of Father Ted's family. We hear from his brother and also one of his nieces in the film. How was it? Who actually captures those interviews, and how was it for them to walk through these memories with you?
Well, I did the interviews with them. I was behind the camera for those. I think that when I sat down with Jim Hesburgh, who is 80, I think he was 85 when I sat down with him, and Jim's still doing great. He's got a lot of energy, and he's a great guy. But sitting down with Jim Hesburgh, you kind of realize, this is a person who knows more about Father Ted than I'll ever know. I could do 10 years worth of research, and I'm not going to know as much as his brother did. Yet at the same time, I think Jim sat there across the room from me during the interview and realized right away we had done our homework.
Right.
I mean, my team and I really rose to the occasion and knew that this film really has to stand up to his legacy and perhaps even enhance and further his legacy. And so this is the kind of interview that I would spend a month preparing for. And in fact, after Jim Hesburgh saw the film about a year later, we showed him kind of a rough cut, maybe a little further along than a rough cut. He thanked me for doing this for his brother. And he said, there are so many things in this film that I had no idea my brother was a part of. He said, I learned a lot watching your movie, and this means a tremendous amount to me. So for me and for my team, that is equally as important or even more important than getting a good review from someone who didn't know Father Ted.
Right.
To have his brother or his niece turn to me and say, you did it. You captured this man with your film. That, to me, is what we always aim to achieve, and I think that's what we've done with Hesburgh.
So one note that I'll make that I was actually really happy about personally is that you don't shy away from some of the more challenging chapters of the university. And one of them happened in recent years. And while Father Ted wasn't peripheral to the decision, you highlight the visit of President Obama to campus and, that moment through the prism of what it meant to Father Hesburgh for the first president, the first African-American or Black president to be on campus, and how that, having seen it through the prism of all the work that he'd done in the civil rights movement, to have this moment, really fabulous. And yet you also show the difficulty of that moment for the university and some of those who were opposed to the decision. How was it? How did you decide to handle that particular aspect of the film?
Yeah. When Father Ted was, I think he was around, I want to just do my math really quickly. I think he was around 92 years old, I believe. That was the year that President Obama was elected president. And because Father Ted was so instrumental in the Commission on Civil Rights, in fact, he was the chairman of the Commission on Civil Rights. There's only 6 people on the whole commission. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, those are pretty big positions. Because Father Ted was so instrumental in advancing the rights of all Americans, not just African Americans, but all Americans, we felt that President Obama's visit to Notre Dame in 2009 was a very important moment, partly because there was a lot of controversy surrounding his visit. I think the students and I think a lot of the faculty were thrilled that President Obama is coming to Notre Dame only months after being inaugurated, and he's going to speak to the graduating class. That was a big deal. However, for people who are very active in the Right to Life movement, or the pro-life movement, let's say, they saw this as an opportunity to protest President Obama and legislation in our country that they don't agree with. And in some ways, I feel like even though Father Ted was no longer president of the university, he was the president emeritus. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, he was certainly the most important of elder statesmen at Notre Dame when this visit occurred. And the president at the time, Father John Jenkins, he found himself in the middle of a firestorm. It was a national news story for weeks, whether or not Obama was actually going to visit or whether the visit would be blocked by people who felt this was inappropriate, et cetera. And Father Ted put an end to it very quickly. He said, look, because we are a university, we want to welcome people with differing viewpoints as ours. And not only that, I think for Father Ted, it meant a lot to see an African-American become president of the United States. There was a lot going on that day, the day Obama came to visit Notre Dame. And I think in a way, you know, look, you either are committed to tolerance or intolerance. You're either committed to love or hate. You're either committed to, sort of making peace with your neighbor or being at war with your neighbor. Father Ted never let anyone who had any opinion different from his stand in the way of making a friendship and finding common ground. That is a defining characteristic of who Father Ted was. And I think when you look around our society at the moment, especially amongst our political leaders, I think we've lost that. I think we have forgotten the importance and the value in kindness and decency. And until we get back to that, I don't know how we are going to break through the sort of dysfunctional government that we find ourselves being ruled by. The funny thing about this film is that Father Ted Hesburgh did his best work 40 or 50 years ago, 60 years ago even. And yet his story is so incredibly timely right now. I think that the world really needs the story of Father Ted right in this moment, which makes the fact that the film is coming out on April 26th, it'll be in theaters nationwide on May 3rd. The timing on this film I don't think could be any better, and we are just thrilled to share his story with as many people as we can.
Well, it's I agree with you that the handling of that particular moment in his history was one of my favorites. But I have to ask you my last question, which relates to really part of the film that I was most touched by, and that's in the very kind of closing moments. You feature Father Ted's caregiver and her relationship with him. Can you say a little bit more about that choice and what she brings to the film?
Yeah, there was a woman named Amivi. She was born in Africa. I believe she was born in Ghana. I have to actually double check that. But she was really one of Father Ted's best friends at the end of his life because she saw him every day. You know, she was his caregiver at the Holy Cross House, which is where the retired priests spend their the final chapter of their life. And there's something about their friendship that I found very moving. This is a woman who was born on the other side of the ocean, in a very different place than South Bend, Indiana, a very different place than America. And yet she was also raised in the Catholic tradition. And on Father Ted's final day, would prove to be his final day here on earth, she got him dressed like she always did. She took him to Mass, which she always did. He went to Mass every single day, said Mass every single day, until his final day. And then later on in the day, he started to really go. You could tell it was going to be his last day, and his health was declining very rapidly. And he asked for her. So she went to his bedside. He was pretty much blind at this point. He really couldn't see in his final year or two. But he asked for Amivi. He held her hand, and he asked for them to say the rosary together. So the two of them sat there and said the rosary in French. Father Ted spoke French. They said the rosary in French, holding hands. His family was there in the room as well, but Amivi was right at his bedside. And then, after that was over, he said to her, Amivi, what do I do now? And she said, I get a little emotional thinking about it, but she said, now you close your eyes and wake up in heaven.
Yeah. That's why the critic was emotional too in watching it.
And what I love about that is, in that moment between the two of them, the connection that they had, despite their differences, but the connection that those two human beings had, that's the world that I want to live in.
Amen.
I think we've found ourselves in a world where there's a lot more hatred than there is love, and there's a lot more misunderstanding than there is, kindness and forgiveness and understanding of each other. And Father Ted was an example, and those around him were examples of the value in connecting with each other. And I think that's maybe the best moment in the film.
Well, they're in a film filled with many wonderful moments. I have to say that was absolutely one of my favorites. The name of the film again is Hesburgh. This will be opening in selected cities on April 26th and then nationwide on May 3rd. Patrick Creadon, such a delight to have the opportunity to speak with you. I'm so grateful for the body of your work, but especially for Hesburgh. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's been a pleasure. And I needed a good cry.
Well, again, big thanks to Patrick Creadon. I have to also throw a shout out to his partner in the film, Christine O'Malley. I'm just really excited for everyone to see Hesburgh, to hear your comments on the film. And really, I think it's just a remarkable documentary that will definitely open lots of great conversations. So let me know what you think of it when you have a chance to see it. We're definitely going to have links over in our show notes at lisahendey.com and at Breadbox Media for you to find information on how to get tickets for Hesburgh, opening nationwide on May 3rd. As we round out this week's show, I'm going to ask you, as I often do, for your feedback. You can leave me a star rating or a review over at iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. Definitely pay a visit to breadboxmedia.com, my podcasting home, where you can find all kinds of other great shows. And let me know who you'd like to hear on the show. I'm always looking for guests. And as usual, lately, I'll ask for your prayers for our family. And I promise to keep you in mind. Until next time, have a great week, everybody. God bless. See you next time.
Breadbox Media programming is brought to you by Jack Kane Ford. Find your next Ford Tough vehicle at caneford.com. CMF Curo is the country's first Catholic healthcare ministry to provide an affordable health sharing solution rooted in Catholic teaching and community. Learn more at mycatholichealthcare.com/podcast. That's mycatholichealthcare.com/podcast.